Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kobe Rizek, and I'm the Publicity Director of the William F. Buckley Jr. program at Yale. I'd like to welcome you to our third installment of our Stephen Hayward lecture series on conservatism. Today's lecture is on Varieties of Conservative Experience. Before I introduce Dr. Hayward, I want to make a couple quick announcements. Firstly, for those of you who don't know, the Buckley program is an organization dedicated to increasing intellectual diversity and free speech on Yale's campus. We do so in a variety of ways, including hosting lectures, dinner seminars, firing line debates, and conferences. You can learn more about the program on our website at buckleyprogram.com. Secondly, a reminder that our annual fall conference on Russell Kirk and the Conservative Mind Today is next Friday, November 2nd. We will enjoy an opening address from one of the world's foremost experts on Russell Kirk, Dr. Bradley Birzer. Later in the day, we look forward to compelling and interesting panels on different aspects of Kirk's legacy in the U.S. and beyond. Experts and power players on the American political scene will take part in panels such as Russell Kirk at 100, His Life, Ideas, and Legacy, Conservatism and Libertarianism, a Union of Ice and Fire, and Liberal Education and the Ideal University. Some of our guests include American historian Dr. George Nash, National Review online editor Charlie Cook, President of Wesleyan University Michael Roth, and a delightful keynote by renowned American journalist George Will. These are just a few of the many academics and commentators who will be joining us next week. Finally, I'd like to note that this is the third of a series of 5 lectures that Dr. Hayward will be giving over the course of this semester. He'll be coming back to us on November 8th and November 27th to finish us off. Now on to Dr. Hayward. Stephen Hayward is currently a senior resident scholar at the University of California, Berkeley's Institute of Government. He's also the Thomas Smith Distinguished Fellow at the John M. Ashbrook Center at Ashland University. Before this work, Dr. Hayward worked as the F.K. Weyerhaeuser Fellow in Law and Economics at the American Enterprise Institute. Dr. Hayward has also written many books on topics such as the environment and President Ronald Reagan. Finally, he has been published in many prominent publications, ranging from the National Review to the New York Times to the Wall Street Journal. We're very excited to have Dr. Hayward here with us today to share his thoughts on conservatism. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Steve Hayward.
Thank you, Cody. Well, thank you very much, Cody. And before I get really started in earnest, I have to give a mild warning that I have a bit of a scratchy throat. I was felled by a nasty case of bronchitis last week. And it's mostly gone, but I've still, I may have to hack and cough a couple times getting through this, in which case just consider it my reenactment of the Hillary Clinton 2016 campaign. And I am delighted to hear about the Kirk conference coming up, which I think is going to be terrific. And in some ways, I'm delighted that my lecture today will maybe set it up in some ways. I'm going to mention Kirk in passing, but I think the architecture of what I'm doing today will set up the conference wonderfully for those of you who I hope you will all go. I wish I could come myself. I've titled this Varieties of Conservative Experience in homage to the famous William James title that everyone knows, Varieties of Religious Experience, although I could have called it and thought about calling it Conservative Fight Club, because I'm going to talk a bit about the fights conservatives have. But I stuck with the William James title because if you know that book, or even if you don't know it or only just know the title, I think the way James analyzed religion more than 100 years ago is actually quite applicable to this topic. And here's why. A lot of the critics of conservatism today tend to lump the right into just one amorphous mass and reduce it to bad motives. Chiefly that conservatism is simply an ideology of oppression and racism and hierarchy and power. See especially the popular critiques today by Corey Robin in his book, The Reactionary Mind, or more recently, historian Nancy MacLean in her book, Democracy in Chains. And beyond those intellectual approaches, there are the social scientists who provide the most amusement, I think. A lot of social scientists and social psychologists have adduced evidence that people of a conservative disposition suffer from psychological or pathological disorders. Right? The authoritarian personality, that idea has been around for decades. It goes back to Adorno and some of the Frankfurt School people. But more recently, you see psychologists saying that conservatives suffer from a paranoid personality or even psychoses There's even one study speculating that there might be a conservative gene, like the oft speculated about gay gene. Now, my favorite amongst all these, and I have a long list of them, is a study in 2012 in the American Journal of Political Science that found that conservatives were psychotic while liberals were merely neurotic. Insert your own Woody Allen joke here. But the neurotic liberals were at least more open-minded and socially adaptable than conservatives were. Now, the embarrassment was, it was discovered after the study was published that the researchers had botched the coding of their data. And so while the data analysis was correct, the categories were exactly reversed. It turned out that it was conservatives who were neurotic, but more open-minded and adaptable, and liberals who were psychotic. What would we do without social scientists? Now, I will treat the details of some of these specific attacks in a later lecture, but suffice it to say as a placeholder for the moment that all these approaches to conservatism suffer the defect of assuming their conclusion as their premise. And then they never have to undertake, when you do that, an honest engagement with the substance of their targets. You know, Corey Robin thinks conservatism is all about hierarchy, end of story. Beginning of story, end of story, right? Now, this brings me back to William James. At the time that William James decided to study religion seriously over 100 years ago, what he noticed was that both psychology and modern philosophy thought or had a same kind of reductive approach toward religion. This was, they thought it was all neurotic. That was a prominent idea about religion. You know, Freudianism was just starting to take root in the 1890s and so forth. Or that there were other illusions that led to the religious impulse in human beings. And James, who was himself skeptical of religion and God, thought this was a mistake. And he thought that we ought to approach religion afresh with no preconceived ideas or reductionist theories. So, in other words, it's a mistake to understand religion as a sub-rational phenomenon. And that's my opening proposition about conservatism. Here's how James objected, and I think you can see how this transfers well to ideas today. Quote, "In the natural sciences and industrial arts, it never occurs to anyone to try to refute opinions by showing up their author's neurotic constitution. When we read such proclamations of the intellect, bent on showing the existential conditions of absolutely everything, we feel, quite apart from our legitimate impatience at the somewhat ridiculous swagger of the program, in view of what the authors are actually able to perform, we find that our views are menaced and negated in the springs of our innermost life. Such cold-blooded assimilations threaten, we think, to undo our soul's vital secrets, as if the same breath which should succeed in explaining their origin would simultaneously explain away their significance." I rather like that phrase in the middle, the ridiculous swagger of the program, which strikes me as a decent characterization of some of the frothier critics of conservatism today. Now, the biggest problem with what is essentially a reductive partisan approach is that it represents a depreciation of reason and a subordination of ideas to pure passion or interest. Now, those are not illegitimate factors to consider, but we lack a complete picture of ideas and principles if we treat them as epiphenomenon of something else. And that's not a promising way forward for a diverse people. I think T.S. Eliot put it best when he said that conservatism is best understood by, and I quote him here, "a careful examination of its behavior throughout its history, and by examination of what its more thoughtful and philosophical minds have said on its behalf." Close quote. Now, this topic is surely complicated by politics. That's obviously true. And to be sure, conservatism, starting 70 years ago or so, became a self-conscious and purposive political movement, much like the movement of the New Left in the 60s thought of itself as a movement with a capital M and a program in mind. That complicates things. But what I want to do is spend the bulk of this lecture going over what I call the varieties of conservatism, or variety of conservatives' experience, that tend to confuse everyone, including many conservatives. Let's start out to set the scene with a single observation from Samuel Huntington's classic 1956 essay called Conservatism as an Ideology. Huntington wrote this, quote, "Conservatives do not subdivide into schools, nor do they, like liberals and Marxists, engage in fiery arguments over the meaning of their faith," close quote. Now, Huntington was a great thinker, and this essay on conservatism is still well worth reading today. But his judgment that conservatives don't have schools and have fiery arguments couldn't be more wrong than a Nate Silver prediction of a Hillary Clinton victory on election night in 2016. Now, there is no conservative fight club rule that you don't talk about conservative fight club. In fact, conservatives talk and fight about their differences incessantly. But few in the wider world took much notice of this for a very long time. Now, that started to change about 20 years ago when some liberal historians started saying, hey, wait a minute, there may be more going on here than we used to perceive. People like Alan Brinkley at Columbia is a good example. There are almost as many subdivisions among conservatives as there are Protestant denominations. And gatherings to discuss conservative differences can sometimes take on the characteristics of the Star Wars bar scene, believe me. And I will add that I think these disagreements on the right have been much to the advantage of conservatism. I think liberalism would be better off if they had more fights amongst themselves. They do have some that are interesting, but not as many as conservatives do. Now, I think you can make out 5 major distinct schools of conservatism. They each have their own meaningful subdivisions, but I don't want to make this taxonomy the length and complexity of Elizabeth Warren's family tree, so I'm going to keep it to the main 5. The first sect, number 1, would be traditional conservatives. And you can tell by the modifier traditional what is at the heart of that. They're the Burkeans, the Kirkians. I've always thought it interesting that Burke and Kirk rhyme because their thinking is so much alike. And the distinctive traits of traditional conservatives are a skepticism of Enlightenment reason, a rejection of the pretensions of social science. Traditional conservatives are, skepticism is too mild a term. They're really opposed to social science for a bunch of reasons. They don't think that scientific expertise can go that far in improving our social order. They also have an attachment to the local and the small. They like that phrase of Edmund Burke about our little platoons that we belong to in society. And think that what is important about human life are the local aspects of it, the communities we belong to, the things that we generate in our neighborhoods, in our towns. You might even call that diversity. Complicated term these days, since the way diversity is used increasingly is exactly the opposite. It means uniformity these days, right? It's exactly the opposite of the common sense meaning of the word. Another important point, though, about traditional conservatives is they think there are more inherent limitations to individual autonomy than liberals do. If I had to sum up the social outlook of traditional conservatism in one sentence, for the purpose of differentiating it from other kinds of conservatism and also from liberalism, it would be this. Individual is not a noun. It is an adjective. For a conservative, there is no such thing as an individual. To use the now archaic language of John Donne, no man is an island unto himself. We're all part of a social fabric and social order, whether we like it or not. And that social order, of course, includes private institutions like family, church, neighborhood, job, occupation, as well as public institution and especially laws. Or as Aristotle, the first conservative, I always say, put it, anyone who doesn't live in a civil society is either a beast or a god. So traditional conservatives emphasize the local over the national or the global, but to call them federalists would be almost an insult because even the state level is too large. Traditional conservatives tend to favor the small town to big cities. This is one reason a lot of traditional conservatives love the phrase ordered liberty, which might sound like an oxymoron. Ordered liberty sound like they're in tension with one another. But I think that, well, we'll say more about this. I'm sure you're going to get into the idea of ordered liberty. Kirk was the great champion of the idea of ordered liberty. I'm sure you'll get into that heavily in the conference, so I won't say too much more about it today. But it's what makes traditional conservatives skeptical of reform. not necessarily categorically opposed to it, but skeptical. They place a higher burden of proof on reform and change. And I mentioned skeptical of reason or Enlightenment reason or purely scientific approaches to life. Maybe the best expression of this, or one of the best expressions of this, comes from John Dickinson. He was the author of the famous Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer at the time of the American Revolution. And he expressed the traditional disposition of conservatives very aptly in the following paragraph. Quote, "Experience must be our only guide. Reason may mislead us. It was not reason that discovered the singular and admirable mechanism of the British Constitution." This really is the voice of Edmund Burke you're hearing in the background here. "It was not reason that discovered, or even could have discovered, the odd, and in the eye of those who are governed by reason, the absurd mode of trial by jury. Accidents probably produced these discoveries, and experience has given sanction to them. This, then, was our guide." In other words, a better guide than reason is experience. Abraham Lincoln had a similar formulation. Quote, "What is conservatism? Is it not adherence to the old and tried against the new and untried?" I'll add this, that traditional conservatives place a lot of weight on imagination, and a lot of traditional conservatives tend to be literary figures. In fact, academically, a lot of them are English professors. I'll come back to that in a little while. Russell Kirk wrote ghost stories. In fact, there are a lot of people speculated, you should ask Brad Berger about this when he's here, that if he'd chosen to write ghost stories more than his nonfiction works, he could have rivaled Stephen King as a master of the horror genre. Who knows? Traditional conservatives also tend to like novelists like Flannery O'Connor and Walker Percy, even though neither of them were explicitly political writers as such. Now, I will add that while you're celebrating Kirk, I think that the person alive today who is by far the leading advocate of traditional conservatism has to be Sir Roger Scruton of Great Britain, who's written more than 50 books, among them novels, reflections on wine, food, music, art, architecture, even sex, as well as conventional works on philosophy. He's even written what I jokingly refer to as a self-help book called How to Be a Conservative, which I highly recommend. I kid him that if you have to tell somebody how to do it, they're not going to be any good at it, but that's another story. There's one more thing about traditional conservatives that's worth noting, and it'll provide our pivot to school number 2. They tend to be very suspicious of foreign entanglements for exactly the reasons George Washington laid out in his warning in the farewell address. And many traditional conservatives dislike our large military establishment and our foreign interventions of the last 50 years, and almost as much as many on the left do or did. Traditional conservatives formed the bedrock of the isolationism on the right of the 1940s and 50s. There are a number of traditional conservatives who, not very loudly, but thought the Vietnam War was a bad idea, and much more loudly opposed both of the Gulf Wars under both Presidents Bush. And our patron of this organization, William F. Buckley, late in life, said that one of his 2 major regrets was having supported the Vietnam War back in the 60s and 70s. There is, by the way, some interesting survey evidence that suggests that Donald Trump's neo-isolationist stands in the campaign in 2015 and 2016 on our overseas military commitments attracted a non-trivial number of votes in those key upper Midwestern states, a factor that is not much mentioned in the analysis of how that election fell out. That brings me to my second major school of conservative thought that shares this view with traditional conservatives, but only this view. And that would be your libertarians, or classical liberals, as they often like to call themselves. Many libertarians insist they shouldn't be thought of as conservatives at all. And they have a point. One of Friedrich Hayek's most famous essays was called Why I Am Not a Conservative. And it's thought to have been written as a rebuttal of sorts to Russell Kirk's conservative mind. Now, for his own part, Russell Kirk was happy to reciprocate the lack of mutual regard. In one of his supremely cranky moments, he wrote that, quote, "A libertarian conservative is as rare a bird as a Jewish Nazi," close quote. If that seems a bit strong, it is. there's more like that in one of his famous essays attacking libertarians. And I mean, the reason is on a serious level, beyond just the insult and the pointed barb, is that libertarianism is highly individualistic, highly oriented toward rationality and science, enthusiastic about change and progress, and above all, believe in the logic of the free market to maximize human well-being. I should add that traditional conservatives, they don't like socialism, of course, didn't like the New Deal or the Great Society, but they're not free market purists. I could easily imagine Russell Kirk having, if he lived a few more years, he died in 1995, I think, I could easily imagine him siding with the left about Walmart, for example. Remember, the left disliked Walmart, more recently for labor practices and other things, but 25 years ago, the complaint about Walmart, it was what? It was ruining old downtowns of small towns. And the empirical evidence on that is mixed, but you could see the logic of it, right? Russell Kirk would hate Starbucks, just for the uniformity of it, right? Fast food, oh my God, he hated interstate highways because of the uniformity of them, right? How it ruined the spontaneous, everything's the same on an interstate highway, right? You drive all the way across the country on an interstate, you'll see the same 5 fast food restaurants at every interchange, and you never actually get to Ma's Diner. Or, my rule, if you take back roads across America, which I've done 2 or 3 times, is any place that has a neon sign that says eat, it's a great place to eat. It's usually great food. But you never quite know. It's the unpredictability of it, right? There's more to be said about libertarians. They tend to be culturally liberal. I like to joke that, it's only slightly a joke, that whereas a traditional conservative would like to watch Ed Sullivan reruns and turn in at 9:30, libertarians flock every year to Burning Man. That's true, by the way. On social issues, we know libertarians tend to side with liberals much more often. For example, when libertarians supported same-sex marriage long before it became a prominent issue 20 years ago or so, but with a twist. They think marriage should be simply a matter of private contract between consenting adults of whatever number, including, for some, even polygamy, with no government involvement or sanction at all. Why should we need a license from the state to get married? It should just be a private transaction, right? Most libertarians are pro-choice on abortion, whereas most other kinds of conservatives are pro-life. And of course, libertarians have long been among the leading voices for drug legalization. Although it is important to note that National Review and Bill Buckley tentatively supported drug legalization from time to time, although for somewhat different reasons than the libertarians. And as I said a moment ago, it's quite notable that libertarians oppose military interventions, which we saw in the last 20 years in the viewpoints of Rand Paul following in his father's well-worn footsteps. Now, I think it is important to note that amongst libertarians, there are a number of distinct schools of thought. And I promise not to do too many family trees, but I think this one requires a little bit more to be said. There's the economists like Milton Friedman in the Chicago School, who applied their insights on markets to economic policy, of course, where they have been maybe the most successful school of conservative thought of any of them, which is kind of ironic given the limited appeal of libertarianism to voters at large. That, I think, tells you something of the power of ideas to persuade. There are the sects among libertarians like the followers of Ayn Rand, whose hyper-individualism and defense of free markets is based on philosophic grounds, not on the grounds of utility, as it is for economists. And as you may know, she's most famous for her novels, but she also worked out a complete philosophy called objectivism, which always to me seemed like just repackaged Nietzsche. And one of her nonfiction books, in fact, is called The Virtue of Selfishness, right? There's nothing about enlightened self-interest or the way Tocqueville and others talked about, or Adam Smith or Locke. It's very different than, say, Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments. There's still more shadings I could go into. The Austrian School of Economics versus the Chicago School of Economics. They have some pretty sharp arguments. There's big fights between the followers of Friedrich Hayek and the followers of Murray Rothbard. There are some academic libertarian philosophers. The children, in some ways, of the late Robert Nozick. He was the libertarian theorist of the minimal night watchman state. I think the prominent names today would be Lauren Lamaski, Eric Mack, and Mike Humer. And then there are the self-described anarcho-capitalists, whose exact shtick I have trouble understanding and describing clearly, so I won't try. Now, the fault line between libertarians and just about every other kind of conservatism you can name can be summarized in one word, and that word is virtue. Libertarians and traditional conservatives have been having ferocious debates for at least 60 years along the axis of liberty versus virtue. Traditionalists say, of course we're for liberty, but you have to have virtue for people to be truly free or to be responsible. And that's where the phrase ordered liberty derives from partly, right? And for libertarians, that's a cop-out. It's a slippery slope to statism, if not socialism. The libertarian thinks, yeah, virtue's nice, but it's not strictly necessary, and certainly not to be sanctioned or imposed or backstopped by the government. The pure libertarian believes much more in a spontaneous order in which the absence of state coercion, they think almost all government activity is coercion, they think that in the absence of that, there'd be a spontaneous order of harmonious cooperation among humans. In this respect, I think doctrinaire libertarians resemble orthodox Marxists. They both believe in the withering away of the state. Now, there are a lot of libertarian thinkers, Richard Epstein's a great example, who don't go anywhere near that far with their principles. And I think libertarian insights and methodologies are very useful in critiquing why just about any government regulation or social intervention is likely to fail or backfire, which I think explains a lot of its enduring appeal. I mean, whenever I hear of a new policy proposal from the government on the national or state level, my first instinct is to call up a libertarian, and they'll be able to tell you immediately why it's likely to go wrong. They just know it instinctively in ways that I always have to puzzle out, right? And I think the embrace of hyper-individualism explains why Ron Paul and then later Rand Paul were so popular with college students. They're often the most popular figures on the right amongst college students whenever an election year rolls around. Now, both traditional conservatism and libertarianism can point to a long intellectual lineage, going back to classical Greece and Rome in the case of traditionalists, and at least back to Adam Smith for the libertarians. But the lineage is more complicated for the third major camp among conservatives, and those would be religious conservatives, or often today called the religious right. Now, it may seem odd on the surface since religion is rooted in some of the most ancient traditions and sources of Western civilization, certainly, and especially the Bible. And you'd think they just fit in with traditional conservatives, and there's certainly a lot of overlap, but there is a distinct aspect to the religious right. It's, first of all, just as a political phenomenon, it's worth keeping in mind that for a good part of the 20th century, in America, devout Christians were either apolitical, a great many of them, or split more or less evenly between the two political parties in their voting behavior. This has all changed starting roughly in the 1970s for a bunch of reasons. But today, religious conservatives are highly organized and politically potent. And today, if you know the survey data, the single greatest predictor of partisan voting habits is regular church or synagogue attendance. Probably mosque attendance too. I'm not sure what the data is on American Muslims, but I suspect it's similar. Regular churchgoers vote heavily Republican, which was not true as recently as the 1970s, when the Protestant vote tilted only slightly Republican. Now it's about 80% Republican. It actually voted majority for Jimmy Carter in 1976. And the Catholic vote tilted Democratic for decades and now leans pretty sharply Republican. Now, the difference, I think, between traditional conservatives and religious conservatives on the level of thought is this. The traditionalists are, as I say, Burkean. They believe in the whole idea of prescription as it comes down to us from Burke. And although most traditional conservatives are also religious sympathizers, if not devout believers, they don't necessarily think that the Bible is the primary source of authority for government and the law. That's what a lot of people on the religious right think, that the Bible should be, as we put it in social science, the normative authority for civil life in modern times. In that respect, the religious right rejects the Enlightenment even more strongly than Burkean traditionalist conservatives. Now, it's not true of all religiously oriented conservatives, and there's not unanimity on everything. Just think of the split amongst religious leaders on the religious right over Donald Trump. Some were and remain deeply opposed to him because of his dodgy personal character, right? While others accommodated themselves to him very easily and quickly. Now, the status of claims on behalf of religious authority in the post-Enlightenment era, or what we sometimes call the post-Christian era, right? That involves a long consideration of the clash between reason and revelation. And that's a long subject that I'm going to take up a little bit in my next lecture when I return, but I won't do it now. But suffice it to say, as a placeholder, that I side with the people who say that the tension between the claims of religion or reason and revelation is part of the secret of the vitality of Western European civilization going back at least 1,000 years, if not longer. Like I say, a lot to be said about that. This provides an opening into the, I'm trying to save a little time here. I won't say any more about science and religion. I'll save that for later. The fourth school of conservative thought is, I think, a phrase that's well known to people today, and that's the neoconservatives. I always think people are familiar with neoconservatives, but I think especially if you're younger, you're a student, you may not really be. Neoconservatism really began back in the 1960s, though it didn't begin to become a self-conscious thing until the mid or late 1970s. And in fact, the term neoconservative, anybody know this, who first came up with that term? It was a socialist, you know? No, he's the godfather of neoconservative. The person who first came up with that label and used it for that circle of people, including Crystal, was Michael Harrington. Prominent guy, now somewhat forgotten, but he was a socialist congressman from Massachusetts. And he didn't mean the term as a compliment, right? He thought this was a bad thing. The old joke is that, this is a joke that I think Irving Kristol came up with, is that a neoconservative is a liberal who's been mugged by reality. Though I should add that most of the so-called neoconservatives were liberals, continue to think of themselves as liberals, and a few, like Daniel Patrick Moynihan, remain liberals for the most part in their general ideology. Certainly, Pat Moynihan's voting behavior in the Senate was orthodox, liberal, democratic. But some of them have been Marxists in their youth. But there's a lot to that cliche of a liberal mugged by reality. Unlike the traditional conservatives, who I say a lot of them were English professors and literary types and opposed to social science, most of the neoconservatives were social scientists. People like James Q. Wilson and Nathan Glazer, Crystal was mentioned, Edward Banfield at Harvard. And what they thought was, our research suggests to us that a lot of liberal interventions, especially the Great Society of Lyndon Johnson, are not only failing to achieve their objectives, but may actually be making problems worse. Now, right away, you see this distinction between traditional conservatives. The neoconservatives are empiricists. And more importantly, they do not have any fundamental objection in principle to the welfare state. Irving Kristol, for example, wrote this late in life, quote, "Neocons do not like the concentration of services in the welfare state and are happy to study alternative ways of delivering these services. But they are impatient with the Hayekian notion that we are on the road to serfdom. Neocons do not feel that kind of alarm or anxiety about the growth of the state in the past century, seeing it as natural, indeed inevitable," close quote. I think Pat Moynihan, who I mentioned a moment ago, as a person who was a strong critic. Actually, Robert F. Kennedy put this once about Moynihan. He says, he knows all the problems. He's against all the solutions. That was way back in 1967, Kennedy said that. Moynihan, in those years, wrote the following, quote, "Liberals must divest themselves of the notion that the nation, and especially the cities, can be run from Washington. The old-time Tories had a point when they said you can't change human nature, for good or ill, with a bill-signing ceremony in the Rose Garden," close quote. Now, this growing skepticism of liberal social policy in the 60s, as the 60s gave way to the 70s, did coincide with the drift of the Democratic Party toward the left, under the influence of the New Left and the anti-Vietnam War movement. Most of those neoconservatives were traditional Truman, Kennedy-style Democrats and Cold Warriors. And so they were dismayed, first by George McGovern, and then they especially disliked détente, even though ironically that's a policy that took shape under Republican presidents initially. So it made for a very confused scene. But the neoconservatives, not all of them became Republicans. Some of them remained Democrats, like Moynihan, like Nat Glazer up at Harvard. And some of them took prominent positions in foreign policy roles in the Reagan administration, like Jeane Kirkpatrick. But then, as I say, it's important to notice it began chiefly as a concern about domestic social policy, domestic cultural issues. I will add that neoconservatives are very much concerned about what the religious right calls family values, but for purely secular reasons, not for religious reasons. But then, starting under the presidency of George W. Bush, neoconservatives became associated with, for some reason, which is still a little odd in some ways, with the aggressive foreign policy crusade of President Bush to spread democracy overseas, which, for example, George Will, coming here next week, said was an entirely unconservative idea. And so that was a very curious term for the neoconservatives and led to a lot of fractionating or factionalization among neoconservatives and somewhat of an eclipse of their influence, I think. Finally, I'll make out a fifth distinct camp of conservatism. Usually those four are the ones that people do as their tent poles. I think there's a fifth one. And I call it American conservatism. At first you might say, well, I understand, patriotism or whatever. But it arises from the question, is there something distinctive about American history and politics and culture that mark out a conservatism in this country as distinct from plain old traditional conservatism of the British, Burkean, or European variety? And I think there is. One good way or one good clue to where this comes, to where you can understand this, comes from Hayek's essay, already mentioned, Why I'm Not a Conservative. He offers in the middle of that essay the important caveat that conservatism in America, remember Hayek was Austrian, even though he spent a lot of his career at the University of Chicago. He said that conservatism in America is very different from European conservatism because defending and conserving American institutions and traditions is itself a defense of freedom. Hayek, by the way, didn't like to call himself a libertarian. He called himself an old Whig in the British sense, which actually lines him up pretty closely to Edmund Burke. And a lot of his writing, if you read it, Hayek's writing, sounds a bit like Burke in places. So it might not seem that what I'm calling American conservatism differs that much from Edmund Burke style or Russell Kirk style conservatism. But the central question involves how you think about the American founding and the character of the American regime itself. Does the American founding represent, in fact, as it says in Latin on our currency, Novus Ordo Seclorum, a new order for the ages? That's a very Enlightenment sounding, very rational, almost French Revolution sounding phrase, right? That we've just, the new science of politics, Hamilton called it. Or was it merely an act of vindicating our historic rights as Englishmen? In other words, just a continuity with the English experience. You can cut it both ways. Vigorous debates about this, and you can even synthesize them to some extent. And there are, like I say, ferocious arguments about this, and I'll have more to say about this in my final lecture later next month. But for the moment, in shorthand, the dispute can be reduced to one question. How do you think about the Declaration of Independence? In particular, its most famous phrase, all men are created equal. Traditional conservatives like Kirk tend to dislike the Declaration. People I'm calling American conservatives think it is correct and of central importance to understanding America. So to move toward a conclusion, how does this all add up? Can these various camps fit together in any way? Are the differences real or are they just idiosyncratic? I do have a crude shorthand for the kinds of people you find in each camp. I actually have two different ways of doing it. One is what kind of professions you find them from, mostly. What kind of novels they read. So, for example, I already mentioned traditional conservatives tend to be English professors and historians. Libertarians tend to be economists, often law professors also. Religious conservatives tend to be theologians or clerics or people who be clerics. Neoconservatives tend to be social scientists. American conservatives tend to be political scientists or political philosophers. When you think about the novels they read, traditional conservatives, they love the old standards of English lit, or at least the old English lit. You know, Jane Austen, Charles Dickens, the Bronte sisters, right? Libertarians, they love science fiction. Religious conservatives, they like C.S. Lewis, of course. Needless to say, Tolkien's great works. The Left Behind series of novels, which is very much a Protestant Pentecostal phenomenon that sell in huge quantities, but somehow never make the New York Times bestseller list because for some odd reason, right? Neoconservatives like contemporary novelists like Philip Roth. And the American conservatives, well, they love Mark Twain above anybody else. But also Nathaniel Hawthorne, in modern times, Larry McMurtry's Lonesome Dove. They really love the John Ford Western movies. And I thought about this once and realized I actually saw it happen once. I was at a small conference with a cross-section of people from the right, and we had an afternoon, a few hours free. We went to a big used bookstore. And it was only afterwards I thought I should have just sat back and taken notes as to which shelves everybody went to based on their disposition. It really did fall out the way I just laid it out there. So you add them all up the way I've sketched them out here, and you have a typical faculty meeting, right? Lots of infighting and disagreements, lots of bad blood. Like I said, traditionalists don't like libertarians, libertarians don't like anybody, and traditionalists also don't like neoconservatives. I'll just give you one sample here as I draw it towards questions. The historian Stephen Tonsor from the University of Michigan, he passed away a few years ago, but prominent writer on the right, used to be in National Review fairly often back in the 70s and 80s. In 1986, he gave a very controversial speech, controversial in most part for this passage, quote, about neoconservatives, quote, "It has always struck me as odd, even perverse, that former Marxists have been permitted, yes, invited, to play such a leading role in the conservative movement of the 20th century. It is splendid when the town whore gets religion and joins the church. Now and then she makes a good choir director, but when she begins to tell the minister what he ought to say in his Sunday sermons, matters have been carried too far." So tell us what you really think, right? And American conservatives, the last group I mentioned, they don't care much for traditionalists. So Wilmore Kendall, famous here at Yale in the 50s, about whom I'll say a lot more in a future lecture, he wrote this of Russell Kirk. "Let us ask, is the teaching," means the teaching of the conservative mind, "is the teaching sound? That is, a teaching that contemporary American conservatism would be well advised to let the benevolent sage of Mecosta talk it into accepting." Mecosta was Kirk's home in Michigan. That's why he's called Benevolent Sage of Mecosta. Continue with Kendall. "And let us give at once the only possible answer, which is no." So you can see there's lots of lively, spirited, no-holds-barred arguments amongst these different camps of the conservative fight club. I can go on a lot. The inventory of these kinds of fights is very long. I've just given you a few samples. It was thought when the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union imploded 30-some years ago, almost 30 years ago now, and it looked like the sort of classical liberal market order and liberal democracy was the wave of the future for the whole world as far as the eye could see. People thought the conservative coalition is going to crack up. It doesn't have communism or the opposition to communism and socialism to bind it together anymore. And despite the theoretical tensions that I've outlined here, that really has not happened very much. I think there are 4 reasons for it. The first is that whatever their theoretical differences, everybody on the spectrum on the right does have an attachment to liberty, variously understood. I think, secondly, and obviously a corollary to that, is the unity of the right owes to an ongoing opposition to the persistent growth and centralization of political power. That's easy to agree upon. But then there are 2 more factors. It's one thing that, as a practical matter, to be against, universalized health care in a big country like this, or higher taxes, or, various regulatory schemes you can think of. But we now live at a time when of the relentless politicization of everything. I mean, on college campuses, you're familiar, of course, with the whole worry about microaggressions. I was astonished a few months ago when there erupted a controversy about how the most popular sitcom of the 1990s, not that long ago, remember Friends? I never watched it much, but was suddenly politically incorrect and objectionable because of stereotypes and insults of, Friends can't be rerun just 20 years later. Not to mention movies you couldn't not only show today, but couldn't make today in Hollywood. My favorite example, and I understand why, is Blazing Saddles, written by the preeminent black comic of the 1970s. But today might start a riot if you showed it unadulterated on campus, right? You can go on down the list. We politicize everything, and then finally, connected to that more broadly, is what Roger Scruton calls a culture of repudiation that's now prominent on the left. It's one thing to be critical of civilization. That's what Rousseau is doing, right? It's what all the great philosophers and social critics have always done. But today, a lot of the energy on the left is in a wholesale repudiation of everything in our cultural and civilizational heritage, right? I think I already made reference here previously to the chant at Stanford when my wife was a student there in the 80s, led by Jesse Jackson, hey, hey, ho, ho, Western culture's got to go. And, controversy about reading lists and, what we used to call the Western canon, which doesn't say the same thing. All those authors disagree with each other, is a canon of just simply oppression and hierarchy and power, and therefore should not even be bothered with anymore. That's what Scruton calls the culture of repudiation. That unites an awful lot of the right, even if they disagree intensely on their theoretical approaches to things. I can go into much greater detail about all of what this involves, and I will in my next two lectures. This is really a preface, not only for your Russell Kirk conference, but also for the final two lectures of this semester. I'll just close with something that grabbed my attention last week. If you didn't see it, Thomas Byrne Edsall, who writes periodically in the New York Times, and who's an old liberal. I mean, he's an old Great Society, New Deal liberal, but has dissented from an awful lot of what you might say is the orthodoxy of the left today. Had a long article in the New York Times on current survey data, and the article's about what's wrong with today's progressives. He's been critical of the progressivism of the left or the liberalism today. And the one that really jumped out at me was the finding from some Pew data that progressive activists are almost 3 times more likely than your typical American to say they are ashamed to be an American. 3 times as likely. It's just a cross-section of everybody, which is a pretty shocking thing. I'm just going to give one preview or commercial for my next lecture, which I'm going to change the title. Right now it just says something anodyne about conservatism and philosophy. Are they frenemies? I'm going to make it more pointed than that. And I'll put it this way. When I come back, I'm going to get into some of these things I've hinted at in a little more detail, including even taking on, as much as I'm reluctant to, what today goes under this broad, overused banner of postmodernism. And I'm going to try to do the approach of Ronald Reagan. Reagan used to say an optimist is someone who sees a pile of manure and says, well, there's got to be a pony in there somewhere. So I'm going to look at, to put it politely, what strikes me as an awful lot of manure from the postmodern left and see if we can't find some usable parts of it or sensible parts that can be argued with in a reasonable way. And I'll tease you a little bit. One of the things I'm going to point out is that there is an element of postmodernism in conservative thought that most people on the left don't see or understand or appreciate. And that might be something worth working on. So I will stop here, and we can now go to audience questions. And yeah, oh good, I've taken way too long. Sorry I went on so long. I didn't mean to. Yeah.
Thank you very much for coming here.
Sure.
I wanted to ask, how would you classify people who are sort of broadly classified as paleocons, like Paul Gottfried, Pat Buchanan, maybe John Derbyshire, Peter Brimelow, like people who are sort of, I guess, were sort of shunned out of, as they call it, conservatism incorporated, and sort of have sometimes more nationalist or sentiments, I guess.
Yeah. The question, if you didn't all hear it, was, what about paleoconservatives? I didn't mark them out as a separate. I thought about mentioning them as a distinct school. People like Pat Buchanan, John Darbyshire, right? Who else you mentioned? Paul Gottfried. Oh, yeah, Gottfried's an interesting guy. Yeah, paleoconservatives, I like to say, I'm not quite sure if they deserve to be a distinct camp of their own. Maybe they do. I like to say they're traditional conservatives with a really bad attitude. And I think as a sort of stylistic description, that's accurate. What I do think, though, is that they have elevated questions of nationalism in some of its. Nationalism is a big problem, right? Too much to try and unravel here, but yeah, they have nativism, and maybe that's a better word for them. It's not so much nationalism, which I think can be rescued and be serviceable. Long conversation to follow, but they're very nativist, right? Which is really odd. Peter Brimelow is an immigrant from England who's almost impossible to understand. I know him a bit, right? And you kind of work really hard to listen to his accent is so thick. Yeah, so in other words, they're sort of unbalanced, or they're overweighted in one aspect of things. You can't really get to the things that they're making a big fuss about from Russell Kirk, I don't think. And so maybe they deserve to be their own. By the way, they chose that name to make themselves distinct from neoconservatives, right? We're so old-fashioned, we're going to be paleoconservatives. I mean, if you call them cavemen, they would take that as a compliment, right? And so it's not clear to me that there's a real doctrine there, a real sort of consistent theoretical teaching that has legs that will last a long time. I think they're going to be, I don't know. I mean, I'm reluctant to compare them to certain things we've seen come and go over the decades, like the John Birch Society, right? That was sort of a very conspiratorial-minded, anti-communist. It was very popular at one point in the 50s and 60s, and it's still around, but it's like sort of a pale, not even a pale shadow. It's like a tiny particle of its old self. And that's where I think once Pat Buchanan and some of the others passed from the scene. Yeah, Gottfried's an interesting guy, but he's a real handful. And so I'm going to not try and unravel him here because I don't have it organized in my head. But yeah. 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 Yeah, and I think, he gets called a fascist and lots of nasty things I don't think he deserves. He's certainly cranky and way out there and distinctive. I find him interesting to read, even though I don't much agree with him. Anyone else? I warn everybody out. You're thinking of one? No, maybe. Yeah, if you want to have another one, go, have at it.
Yeah, I guess there's been a lot of talks about, this idea of post-Trump conservatism and what it will look like. Do you think that we can expect a sort of new redefinition of conservatism, meaningfully different from like the National Review conservatism of the 50s, that will encompass sort of the, some of the Trump ethos without Trump itself, because we're seeming to have like a certain generation of politicians and thinkers who put more focus on immigration and on the idea of the nation than the market or the welfare state than in previous generations. Do you think that it will be a meaningful change, or is that just a sort of a fad?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. The question was Trump. What does Trump mean, right? And what's the legacy of Trump? So a couple of thoughts. One is, let's two or three observations, which I'm not entirely structured the way I would if I was writing an article to think this through. But one is, it's not clear to me that Trumpism is a thing the way, say, Reaganism was, or Thatcherite conservatism in England. I mean, there are some distinctive things. Immigration, trade, or departures. Well, certainly trade is a departure from conservative orthodoxy. The other departure from conservative orthodoxy is, remember, he said, and here lately he was contradicted just in the last week by Mitch McConnell, that he was not going to touch Social Security and Medicare. Now, that's a big departure from conservative orthodoxy. Remember, Paul Ryan is all about cutting Social Security. He'll say reforming, he's right, never mind that for now. But the point is, I think without that pledge, Trump doesn't win. Remember, Trump wins so narrowly that you pull out any particular stick from that broom that he's swept the field with, whatever metaphor you want to use. He may not win. But that was one of them. I think that's, I'm not the only person who thinks this. And so for a lot of those, working class voters who are not ideological, they may be slightly culturally conservative, but they're not part of the conservative movement. A lot of them didn't vote the last 2-3 elections because Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan, yuck. All they want to do is cut taxes for their friends and cut safety net programs that benefit me, right? And but of course, and Trump seems to not care at all about the deficit. Now he has ordered budget departments to cut 5% from their budget, but that's not much in the grand scheme of things. It's the entitlement bomb is what's going to pull us all under sooner or later. And he seems utterly uninterested in that, whereas that was central for Ronald Reagan, somewhat central for the Bushes, especially the first President Bush. And so that's kind of gone. And if the Republican Party abandons being concerned about deficit spending and the size of the national debt, we've really got a problem, right? I mean, Republicans exist for a few things, and one of them is to be concerned about that. But then the second thing I'd say is Trump as a style, right? This, tweeting, insulting, brash guy. It hasn't seemed to work for anybody else. I'm just observing now as a practical political matter. Republican candidates who've tried to copy and be mini Trumps, mostly haven't succeeded, I don't think. Maybe I've missed somebody, but most of them have failed. I think Trump is sui generis. I mean, imagine any sort of, say, quote unquote, normal political candidate for president, a governor, a senator, trying to behave the way he did. He got away with it because he's this massive celebrity. And I don't think anybody else can get away with that. And not clear he can get away with it, right? I mean, it is true, I think, that with an economy with, 3.8% unemployment, 4% economic growth now, we're going along. We're still kind of stuck in Afghanistan, but it's not a miserable large war like Iraq was 10, 12 years ago. His approval ratings ought to be about 60%. That's what Ronald Reagan's were in 1986, when you had low unemployment and good economy. Republicans, by the way, lost very badly in that midterm election in '86, but that's just the cycle of things. And Trump is what? He's right now at a high, maybe, if you like the latest poll, of 47% approval. You got to be at least mid-50s with these kind of conditions. That represents how controversial he is and how put off an awful lot of people are by his manners. And so I don't know. I'm not sure where it's all going to go. I think he's very vulnerable to an economic downturn. An awful lot of Trump's appeal is him being able to say we are winning, and he can point to things that are going well. But boy, if we have an economic problem of any severity, he's going to be in just deep trouble like crazy. Follow up? You wait for the...
I guess I'm more thinking that we've had sort of unorthodox academics like Steve Saylor, I think, is a very good example, that have sort of predicted Trump and that sort of philosophy without the style, but have sort of advocated for it. I mean, Peter Brimlow, another one, for a while. And do you think that there's maybe sort of an ideological appeal that goes just beyond the sound, the celebrity, that explained how maybe he didn't win the general election that well, but he massively destroyed any other sort of Republican candidates that were trying to out-Reagan each other? Does that mean that the conservative party, the conservative movement and National Review sort of has to deal with this? Is there like a new sort of political or intellectual movement that now has regained prominence, or is all of that going to fade away after he's gone? Yeah, well, so a couple thoughts. One is, first of all, I think I'd say National Review, at least on immigration, can claim vindication. Remember, National Review, now it was when before Brimlow really got kind of extreme. I mean, 20-some years ago, and when John O'Sullivan was editor, they were saying, hey, wait a minute, we ought to think about immigration. We ought to reform it. They weren't, they weren't xenophobes. They weren't close the borders. They weren't build a wall. Some flamboyant things we say now, but they say, look, they had very serious arguments about it, and no one really listened to them, right? I think Trump did see that. But then also, if you're probably not old enough, we're going back and reading some of those old issues of National Review from the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, because they talked about immigration is connected with the national question, which didn't mean nationalism in the pejorative ways we often mean it, but saying, look, the glory of American immigration has always been assimilation. We take people from all over the world, they become Americans.
And, that's a long story. I've talked about that previously on visits here, and we'll talk about it again probably. And it's just, so that needs to be talked about again. Well, we are talking about that again a bit. Now, Trump's not any good at it, right? But he's opened that can of worms, so to speak, or he's opened up that question which no one wanted to talk about much, except for National Review for a few years. And then Saylor was, he was always sort of, out there a bit. And, I know him a little bit too. I know everybody pretty much. But then the other thing Trump saw that nobody saw was the resonance of the trade issue. Again, in those upper Midwestern states and other parts of the country. And that's connected a little bit with immigration, only, people in, jobs out, right? And I'll sort of add as a final observation, Trump, think of who Trump vanquished, not just the Republican field, but the Clintons. I mean, he ended the Bushes and the Clintons. I used to joke that, if we had another Bush-Clinton race, I'm going to slit my wrist. It's just going to be Bushes and Clintons forever. It's going to be, George P. Bush against Chelsea Clinton someday. It's going to go on forever. And he beat them both, right? The two most impressive political forces of the last 20 years. That's pretty impressive to do. And, having written about Ronald Reagan, including about how he was not a favorite of the Republican Party establishment in the 70s, and even into his presidency, he was poorly received by an awful lot of Republicans, like Bob Dole, never mind, go down the list. And now everybody claims to be a Reagan Republican, with the conspicuous exception of Trump. If you go back to those debates, everybody, Ted Cruz, Rand, they all fell over themselves to say they were Reagan Republicans. Donald Trump mentioned Reagan the least of all of them. And I don't think that's any, he met Reagan lots of times. I don't think that was any disrespect or dislike of Reagan. It's just the independence and cussedness of Trump. And it has been really impressive and breathtaking to see how it worked. But look, I was wrong. I mean, I'm just giving you some observations. I was so wrong about Trump. I didn't think he'd be nominated. Didn't think he'd be elected. I still every morning sort of, what's he tweeted last night? Right? It's a roller coaster ride. I call it a high. I call Trump, from a Republican point of view, a high beta presidency. To use Wall Street language, high risk, high reward. But I've already mentioned what some of the risks are, and it could be he'll end up, engineering a, durable center-right majority for other Republicans to inherit, and then probably squander, the way the Bushes did. Oh, someone else? Yeah, one more? Okay. Well, maybe I'll be quick, try and squeeze in two. But
like that. So if you could, the 5.5 categories that you've put forward today pretty much work for the Anglo world. If you go to the larger world, those categories work today.
Oh, like me in Europe?
In Europe, in
Middle East?
In Asia.
That's a good question. I'm just going to answer one part of it that comes to mind, and that's China. So it has been a thesis for years amongst, I'd say sort of classical liberals, liberal-minded people, not just conservatives or people on the right, that you couldn't have economic liberty without political liberty following along. And so, what the defenders, I won't put it that way, but people say about Chile is, Chile had a dictator, we backed him, remains very controversial on the left. But today they have a democracy, and what came first was a liberalized economy. Maybe that's not the right story, but the question is, China still has an authoritarian one-party government. They call themselves communists, they're really not, and a market economy. Now it's got lots of controls, and it's maybe it's peculiar to Chinese culture. I don't know, I can't tell. I try to figure it out from time to time, but it's too hard. It's just too big a country, and you probably need to know the language and marinate yourself over there. But I do read things about what's going on in Chinese universities, what students are reading, what kind of conversations are being had and not had, and wondering, is China going to become a pluralist democracy because of an open economy and world trade the way other countries have? And that's an interesting test of various aspects of not just conservative ideas, but I think sort of general liberal ideas that go back a couple hundred years. And we may end up changing our mind about all of that. I don't know. But that's the big question. You can ask the same question about the Middle East and other parts of the world. But let's see, one last quick question in maybe, since I spent so much time with,
Thank you. What's your take on people like David Frum and Jennifer Rubin who have been sort of excised from the conservative movement for being too anti-Trump.
Yeah, well, Jennifer Rubin is completely insane, it seems to me. No, I mean, she'll actually, because now Trump embraces some opinion or some policy idea, she'll take the opposite position, even if that position was the same as hers just 3 years ago. And that just seems like orneriness. Now, Frum's a little more interesting. I know Dave. I don't know Jennifer really. I know David pretty well, and so I'm trying to be a little more charitable. He's a very smart guy. But even he, by the way, if you read him closely, has said he doesn't like Trump because he thinks Trump's character is bad and is, a poor president and all kinds of reasons that make perfectly plausible, sensible things to say. But he does say, if you read him carefully, that Trump is not wrong about some things, especially immigration. And in fact, something he wrote the other day, typically more pungent than even he can sometimes be. He says, look, if people think that only a fascist wants to actually do something serious about immigration, then guess what? The people are going to pick a fascist to do it. This gets back to the National Review argument 25 years ago. If responsible people will not take up this issue, then irresponsible people are going to do it. Now, I don't think Trump's irresponsible. I think it goes too far, but you can see the logic of that argument and why some people think that, who are otherwise, thoughtful and decent people. Well, one last thing. I've been meaning to put together my own, I don't have time, but it is interesting that you can find on YouTube, it's pretty easy, statements from Chuck Schumer, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, Dianne Feinstein, my home state senator, over the last 20 years, all saying we've got to get control of immigration, our border's out of control, people just can't come here. Things that Trump says when Trump has proper grammar. Now, I don't think you'll find a liberal saying anything close to that. And partly that's a reaction to Trump, and that's just the politics of our time. So I put Frum and Rubin a little bit different places on where it's falling out. Did you want to follow up or no? Okay. Well, thank you all very much.